very warm welcome, Your Excellencies, ladies, gentlemen, friends, partners, colleagues, everyone. Welcome to the British Library, where I have the great pleasure of being Chief Executive, and welcome to a little bit of London that is forever Jaipur.
There is a sense of intense homecoming as we return, even though virtually, to JLF in London. It's been a huge privilege to partner with the British Library, and this collaboration has been so full of joy and learning.
It's a particular pleasure for me to come back to the British Library, which has been my office in London for many years, and where my books have all been written and researched, and it's very nice to see this end of my life sort of double back on it.
Our amazing writers, today more than any time, because of the way the digital age has taken over, we need you to be able to make sense of the past, divine the future, and perhaps set in context what we're going through at this very point of time.
This is the first time I've been to it in London. I've been to the one in Rajasthan before, and it's fantastic. It's got a different vibe here, but it's equally wonderful here.
JLF brings this amazing festival to London. It's a wonderful get-together of writers and thinkers, and you know, I only go to one festival, literature festival in the world, and it's this one.
The people who've been here, both bookshop customers, the authors and the organisers, have been an absolute delight to work with. I can honestly say as well that this is the best dressed, most elegantly dressed crowd at any literary festival I've ever seen anywhere.
It's maintained the standards which I'm accustomed to in Jaipur itself, and I'm extremely happy to be part of it here.
I love this festival. I think it's a privilege for me.
JLF deserves enormous congratulation for the way that it puts its program together here. I think that all of the events are superbly chaired. I think that the setting here in the British Library is just a fantastic environment.
Team Arts and British Library welcome you to JLF London's 2020, presented in partnership with the Aga Khan Foundation and our patron, the Murthy Family Foundation. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. We're truly disappointed for not being there in person to receive you, but we promise to be back in 2021. Please do consider donating to help make possible JLF London at the British Library, which is free to view by clicking on the donation link below. It truly will help us enormously in these difficult times. Our next session today is the essential Bernardine Evaristo Girl, Woman, Other in conversation with Anjum Hassan. Navigating through the journey of an interconnected group of 12 Black women, Girl, Woman, Other is a quest for love, hope, and home, spanning across the legacy of contemporary and colonial Britain. In conversation with writer Anjum Hassan, one of Britain's most exciting and original authors, Bernardine Evaristo discusses the idea of womanhood, culture, class, politics, and race coursing through her iconic writings. She speaks of the binding power of collective experiences and gives us a peek into the world of her creative process. Bernardine Evaristo is a British author of 8 works of fiction. Her novel, Girl, Woman, Other, won the Booker Prize in 2019, the British Book Awards Fiction and Author of the Year 2020, and the Indie Book Award for Fiction 2020. In June 2020, she became the first woman of color and the first Black British writer to assume the #1 spot in the UK paperback fiction charts. Congratulations, Bernardine, and welcome to JLF London.
Thank you very much.
Hassan, thanks. Anjum Hassan is the author of the novels The Cosmopolitans, Neti Neti and the Lunatic in My Head, and the short story collections A Day in the Life and Difficult Pleasures. To remember, our sessions are available to view on london.jlflitfest.org and on our Facebook pages, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it into the comment section, and Anjum will pose these of Bernardine at the end of the session. We'd like to thank Lanchura, our podcast partner, for this session. Ladies and gentlemen, the essential Bernardine Evaristo, girl, woman, other, in conversation with Anjum Hassan. Anjum, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. Bernardine, hi, it's great to see you. We were just chatting a few minutes before the session began, and inevitably all discussions about Litfests are about how nice it would have been to see you in person, to meet in person. There's so many kinds of strangeness that we're discussing in this time. And I think when we say it's a strange time, every email you get is prefaced by the words, we're living through a strange time, or it ends with the words, what a strange time, what a surreal time. And I think one of the things this does, this forced distancing, I don't know if you agree, is that it also helps us to realize that the normal was strange in some ways as well. And I think one of those strangenesses to me is how fiction can create an illusion of intimacy. I'm just fresh from reading your novel, your latest novel that Sanjay introduced. And I have this feeling that I know you very well. And that's a feeling, an illusion that only fiction, a particular kind of fiction, can create. I don't know, would you like to say something before I launch off with my first question?
Yeah, well, hello, Anjum. It's lovely to be appearing as part of the festival from my study in London. And that's one of the things, is that we don't actually have to travel at the moment. But of course, we do miss the proper in-person communication with other people, for sure. It's interesting that you said that you feel that you know me very well through my novel, because nobody said that to me before, actually. So I don't know what you think you know about me, and you might know about me as a creative person. But the novel is, it's about these 12 different, primarily Black British women, and they're all very different from me, apart from one of them, who is loosely based on my younger self, and that's Amma, who starts the novel. But I think, but it's really interesting what you say about novels creating a kind of intimacy with the reader, because that's what I hope my work does. And I think if a novel doesn't do that, then perhaps it's not quite working properly. And certainly as a writer, I really dig deep inside my characters to write them. And I feel that I write them from the inside out, and that I know them during the period that I'm writing them very, very intimately. And if that comes over in the reading of the book, then that I think is a wonderful thing, that you feel that you have an intimate connection with all these different voices.
Yes, and when I said the novel creates the feeling that I know the author, I didn't mean it necessarily that I know you personally, and that I'm not necessarily trying to guess or assume that some of these characters or all of these characters are an aspect of you, but more in the sense that I know you in terms of your sensibility, your language, your preferences, your worldview, let's say, your worldview. And I think that word is important maybe to my reading of the novel, because I realized that in telling the stories of these 12 women, you are actually telling their biographies. You, in many cases, it is a story. In most cases, I think it's a story from birth to the present moment in their lives. In some cases, it's a backstory because the characters are very, very old, so there's very long backstories. And I wondered, was that necessary? Because in making these characters the subject of fiction, you can't assume that the reader will know them in that way. In order for them to be subjects of fiction, they have to first be presented as biographical characters, with biographies. Whereas in another, let's say, more mainstream kind of fiction, the reader does not need to be told everything. Whereas if you're writing about the lives of Black women in Britain, and I certainly did not realize that there were so many streams of Black history, genealogy, race within the broad category of Black that were feeding, that could possibly feed the idea of a Black woman character. So did you feel the need to do that sort of biographical detailing? And of course, this is not your first novel. You've got a whole body of work which features Black characters. But that to me was very interesting, that these characters can't come alive, possibly, unless we first know who they are, where they came from.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just going back to my worldview, I think that's absolutely right. Because if you look at this book, you know that Ian McEwan or Julian Barnes or J.K. Rowling would not have written this book. So I guess there is a sense, you know, kind of where I'm coming from and what my interests are in order to write this book. And also my generation, because I'm 61, right? So I've written this book at a certain stage in my life where I have that sort of very broad brush understanding of all the different generations, those that are younger than me and also those that are older than me. The book is, the biographical nature of all the characters' stories is absolutely integral to how I told the novel. And, you know, because they all have their own chapters, these 12 characters. I say Womixen sometimes, W-O-M-X-N, because one character is non-binary. And that's a kind of women of color and trans-inclusive term. So the biographical element of the book, which in a sense is the meat of the novel, is to do with me wanting to really express the psychology and the history of these characters, so that when you encounter them in whatever stage you encounter them in their lives, probably in the present day, if not, you eventually go up to the present day with most of them, that you really do understand who they are, where they come from, what their motivations are, what their ambitions are, their passions, their desires, some of the struggles they've had in their life, as well as the wonderful things that have happened to them and the things that there are to celebrate. And it can only happen through this form. I call it a fusion fiction. And I do actually really like this question, because I have probably done about 200 events and interviews for this book. And at the end of this year, I'm going to sit down, and I keep very good records of everything. I'm going to do a count, right? And I get asked the same questions all the time. But you're asking me questions I haven't been asked. So it's really good, because I have to then think, you know, sometimes I'm on the phone giving an interview and I'm literally sending an email while answering the question because it's become so automatic. But this is not an automatic response to your question. And if it was, as you say, like a traditional novel or a plot-driven novel, you wouldn't necessarily need to know all of that backstory. But actually, with all of my books, to a greater or lesser extent, you get a sense of those characters through who they are in the journey they take in the book, but also through whatever element of their backstory that I throw in. And I find it very hard to write characters without digging into their biography and exploring that for the reader in some way.
Thank you, Bernardine. Biography is very central. A very central part of biography for many of the characters is their politics. And my next question has to do with the politics of the novel, as much as the very different politics of the different characters. There are radical Black lesbian feminists. There are people who believe that they don't want to be representative Black necessarily, that they are just British or represent British society, or don't represent anything at all except themselves. And in between these positions, there are a host of different shades of political opinion. But what I found most interesting and engaging is whenever a character presents a very extreme political position, often to do with ethnicity, but not always, often to do with sexuality as well, you sort of undercut it with a very humorous, often very light touch. Sometimes it even becomes farcical. Without giving anything away, I'm thinking of this wonderful but scary, in some ways, African American woman. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her name right. Is it Zinga or Nzinga? Nzinga. Who starts out being marvelous but gets more and more extreme in her views, till the point where you feel that her belief in her own victimhood becomes the cause of her oppressing other people. And that's just one example. There are others where you start to feel a little alarmed about the character's position, and then it just is totally redeemed somehow. That's the word I would use. And what is it redeemed by? I would again use a word that you use in the novel, that you put in the mouth of one of your characters, which is humanity, humanism. Do you think that's the prerogative or the responsibility of the novelist to bring back everything to the human, if not to humanism?
Well, I guess so, because that's what we're dealing with as writers, you know. But I don't, yeah, I mean, that's certainly one of my preoccupations for sure. But it's so interesting, the whole political aspect of the novel, because I never set out to write a political book. But because I am a political creature, my work is always underpinned by politics in some way. And you're right, because in Girl, Woman, Other, there are so many intersecting identities and points of view and worldviews. And essentially what I wanted to do was to explore the plurality of Black British womanhood. You know, so writing a book like this, and the reason I wrote it, to put us into literature, because we're not really very present. So then I found as many ways as I could of making the women as varied as possible and distinct from each other. And that then means that even though one character may be presenting one kind of argument, another character will counter it. And also people are, as soon as people have an inflated sense, they have an inflated sense of themselves, somebody else will kind of, burst their balloon and actually undermine whatever it is they're saying. And that is also one of my preoccupations. But the humanity of the novel, and I kind of understand this through how people are responding to it, is one of the sort of major kind of areas. No, how would I describe it? It is its overriding trope, if you like, and that is that I'm presenting these characters who are very real, hopefully, very flawed and complex, and as we humans are, very contradictory. And actually, through showing them in that way, with the depth that I do, it actually speaks to all of our humanity. And through showing their humanity, one hopes that then the distances we experience between different groups in society, and that may be nations or cultures or religions or sexualities, class, culture, gender, race, all those things, that distance is somehow reduced or bridged, because we're connecting at a very basic human level with what it means to be human, I guess.
I got the feeling as I was reading the book, and it's reinforced by what you just said, the last bit of what you just said, that there is something very sort of warmly optimistic about this book, and very elevating. One of the reasons I felt that, apart from your way of bringing out the roundedness and the fallibility of each character is the way you treat racism. Now, racism is mentioned very often. It's there in the lives of a lot of characters, both men and women, not only women. In fact, sometimes more men, because it's more, or at least it's more overt and aggressive sometimes in the lives of the Black men in the novel than in the lives of the Black women. But you never really bring it center stage. And what I was curious about is how you see it, because there is an institutionalized racism, there is a racism built into institutions that these women and these families are a part of, but there's also just the everyday slight and the everyday prejudice. And you have characters who sometimes tell each other, maybe it's not racism, maybe it's just having a bad day, or it's just human nature. So again, while you're not glossing it over, this is not a dark, angry book. And you'll have to forgive me because I'm referring so much only to this latest novel, and I don't have the perspective of your other work. What is your take on it?
It's so racism is permeated throughout the novel, in the sense that it's very hard to write about 12 different writers, primarily of color, living in a majority white country, and not to have that part of their lives in different ways and to different degrees. There are characters who, if the book spans over 100 years, I think it spans 125 years. So there are different experiences that people have according to who they are and what era they're living through. And also race is something that it's transmutable. It just, it's sometimes nebulous and you cannot pin it down. And you cannot always define racism for what it is. So what that example you gave, like Shirley, who's a school teacher and she's leading a very middle-class life, and her mother, Winsome, was a bus driver. And Shirley, when she talks to her mother about being slighted because of racism, her mother will say, well, maybe they're just having a bad day. You don't know that that's racism. And that is also the reality of living in this society. You don't know. Yeah. You can assume that it's somebody is victimizing you or treating you badly because of the color of your skin, but often you do not know. It's quite intangible. And so racism is not foregrounded, but then, all those other areas that I mentioned, class, generation, culture, sexuality, gender, nothing is foregrounded, but they're all bubbling away underneath the surface and kind of manifested in different ways. In terms of the optimism of the novel, that is really my worldview. And I think it's the only way to be. I really do. And so I am an eternal optimist. And I try to, I believe in social change. I'm very much an activist outside of writing my own books, and I will work towards social change. And I'm hopeful at the moment that there may be, a little bit more movement in terms of race in this country, simply because of what happened with the Black Lives Matter movement. But one of my sort of defining characteristics as a person, and it's something that I have developed for many decades now, is positivity. And that's how we achieve. That's how I achieve. That's how we keep going. That's how we are able to lead happy lives. And I see how people who are overly negative are destroyed by it. So, but I'm also at the same time, I hope, a compassionate person. And I try to understand why people behave in a certain way. And the book, people have told me, is also a compassionate book. In that, and we go back to the biography of the characters, we understand what drives people, and we understand where they're coming from. And we also understand and perhaps accept their flaws, because we understand that's just who we all are as people. And so, those are some of my kind of responses to that question.
There is definitely a quality of celebration in the novel, not celebration in general, not the humanist, necessarily the humanist quality that I was referring to earlier, but celebration of very specific achievements of the individual characters. You start with this wonderful chapter about a theater director called Amma, and she has come into her own when the novel starts. She's in her 50s. She's worked at the fringes for very long, but now she's showing a play of hers is opening at the National. She has this great audience. So there is professional achievement celebrated in the novel. And time and again, we meet characters who have, through hard work, through persistence, through education, which I was very, very interested in. You often talk about how people can make success of their lives through education. So there's a celebration of being able to break into the system and bend it to your purposes. I thought that was an interesting contrast to another kind of victory. And maybe that's truer of the younger characters, where the success is not so much what you do. It's not the success of Amma, who's a theater director. It's not the success of Shirley, which is a quiet success, but she's a very dedicated teacher. It's not the success of Carol, who's a successful high-flying banker, but they're younger characters like Morgan, the trans person you spoke about, who is sort of celebrated for just who she is. You know, so success is just being able to make space for your identity, which is very different from the other sort of model where you slog and it takes years and you're finally there.
I think ambition is another thing, and education too, but definitely ambition is something that I wanted to explore, and success, and those are things that I'm really interested in this society, because I've been around a long time and I move at quite high levels these days. You know, I'm a professor of creative writing. I'm vice chair of the Royal Society of Literature. I've been very much I write for the national papers. I've been very much part, in a sense, of the literary establishment for quite a while now, while also being radical, right? So I have to say that I don't feel I've sold out through being part of the establishment, but I also think it's really important that we are part of the establishment. And so I have insights, you know, I come from a working class background, state education and so on, immigrant father from Nigeria. So I've also seen how power works and how people become successful at a high level. And I've seen how ambition is so important to all of that, as well as community, actually. And often the communities of which we speak are the invisible networks that we're excluded from in this country. So with all of the characters, and because I have this very positive mental attitude, I wanted them to all be striving for something. And that may be, you know, Hattie at 93 is a farmer in the north of England, and her ambition is to keep her farm going, and to, at the point at which we meet her, to stay on her farm and not be taken off and put into a care home. Emma's the lesbian theatre director who after 40 years has broken through with a play at the National Theatre. And then her daughter is quite an entitled young 19-year-old who's hugely ambitious and actually quite privileged, but unable to see that for herself. But what drives her is an ambition to be a voice in the world. Mm-hmm. And as you say, Morgan is trans, and what drives her through the novel is finding herself, and finding herself in a gender that she's comfortable with. And in their ambitions, especially in the work environment, we see what it takes to achieve or to not achieve. And it's so key to surviving in this country, the work environment. And in a sense, Carol, the banker, she epitomizes somebody who is operating at the highest level, but has also lost part of herself in order to do so, because she goes to Oxford University from a working class immigrant background, Nigerian immigrant background, and she realizes she has to metamorphose into a different kind of person in order to move up the social scale, which she does, but still encounters the kind of racism based on how she looks. So that was fun to do. It was fun to get to create characters who have agency, who have strong desires, to have them achieving, but not unrealistically, but to have them all at some level by the end of the point at which we kind of finish them in the novel, know that they are on the road to something. I'm really not interested in writing Black women characters who are victims. And that there is a certain, appetite, I have to say, for fiction from Africa or African American writers, or perhaps even a little bit British writers, where people want something heartbreaking. They want to be sobbing into their pillow, and I find that so paternalistic and patronizing. And so when people have come to me with the assumption that this book is about suffering, I have to disabuse them of that notion, and they have done. They haven't read the book, but it's about 12 primarily Black British women, so it's got to be about suffering. And no, it's not. The women do struggle, but everybody struggles in life. Yeah. And some of their struggles are to do with being Black women, not always. Yeah. But I was not going to have characters who are crushed by the system in which they find themselves. So that also speaks to this idea that it's a hopeful book. That even though some of them are succeeding on a micro level, such as Letitia, who becomes a supermarket supervisor, it's still that she's rising above, she's certainly rising above the expectations society has of her.
I have to say, talking about tragic novels, that your ending really brought tears to my eyes, but that is not because of tragedy. That's to do with something else altogether that I won't give away at all. We have 5 minutes to audience questions, so I quickly wanted to circle back to where we started, which was with biography, and with the fact that you have to create these characters through their histories in order for them to acquire agency. But you also have a character called Roland Quartre, who's a professor, a very successful, popular intellectual who's on the television, has written lots of books. And he has this interesting position, which I mentioned earlier, that he doesn't want to be seen as talking on behalf of Blacks or representing Blacks. And I remember hearing Ben Okri speak at a festival in Calcutta a few years ago, and he made the same point. I don't think he was influenced by Roland. Maybe it's it's the other way around. I'm not sure. But what do you think of that? I was curious about your take on that.
Yeah. So I said that the book is about the plurality of Black British womanhood. Primarily, it's not about creating any. It's really speaking against reductive notions of who we are and homogeneity. That's what I'm doing, so to create so many characters who are all co-protagonists, and then to have them as distinct from each other, although Roland is not one of the protagonists, but he's a secondary figure, but he's a very strong figure. And you're absolutely right. He's a professor at a university, and he does not want to be seen as a spokesperson for Black people. And really what I'm doing with him is just shining the light on a certain kind of ideology that some people around me have. And my personal opinion of that is that good luck to them. Why should they? Why should you, as a person of color in a majority white society, have to be a spokesperson for all Black people? For a start, that's not achievable. That's unrealistic, because you cannot represent everybody. But why should you be asked to speak up about race when that is not what you're dealing with as a writer or an academic or whatever?
Absolutely.
So we need to have the freedom to be free of those discussions. And at the same time, we also, some of us, need to be involved in those discussions, because if we don't get involved in it, then the debate suffers. So the privilege of not having to wear the label of Black, whatever else, Black professor, Black academic, Black writer, and so on, is something that Roland seeks, but he can't fully escape it. And I fully understand that. But, I believe for myself personally, I believe in personal ambition but I also believe in community responsibility. And that's something that has shaped my career so far. But I don't say that from a kind of a position of moral superiority. I just say that that is the choice that I've made. But I respect other writers and artists who just want to pursue their art. Because surely if we're talking about an equal, egalitarian society, then really people should just be able to do what white writers or white artists do, which is to pursue their art. And if they want to get involved in political debates around their art, then that is their choice. But if they don't, they should have the freedom to just pursue their art. But there's always a context for that. If you choose to not address any of the sort of political issues of the day, then, sometimes that will be imposed on you whether you like it or not. And sometimes there will be resentment about it. But yeah, for me, it's about choice and freedom.
I think that's a lovely note on which to end, choice and freedom. I could have gone on, but I can't because I have to allow the audience in. There's a question from Sanya Bhutani who says, what to you is the most misrepresented or misconstrued aspect of activism with regards to race and or gender? Did you hear that? Could you hear that?
Yes, I'm thinking.
Okay.
The most misconstrued aspect of it. I think when you have activist groups who are trying to progress society, whether it is on race, gender, sexuality, class, whatever, then I think that rattles the establishment. In this country, in that would mean essentially, a majority a patriarchal, majority male, white establishment can be very rattled by all these things, and that extends to the media. And so what happens is these people who are fighting for social change are often vilified and seen as troublemakers and radicals. But let's analyze what a radical is. A radical is simply somebody who wants social change and who is exposing depends on which kind of radical you're talking about, okay? But if you talk about, somebody who is radically for feminism, for example, then they deeply and passionately believe that women need to be equal in this society in every way possible. That's something to be commended. That's not something to be vilified. But actually what happens is that these social groups are often vilified by the establishment, and then the general public who read the papers that vilify these people then get a very twisted view of people who are actually just trying to make our society more equitable. So perhaps that's one of the ways in which it happens.
Mm-hmm. There's a related question.
Actually, I could have said a lot more, but yeah, let's move on.
Sure. There's a related question about the Black Lives Matter movement from Kamya, who says, it's taken the world by storm. How do you think art and expression through stories has influenced this movement?
How it has influenced the movement?
How art and expressions through stories, how stories have influenced the movement?
That's well, I don't know really. I haven't thought about that because I think of it as the other way around. I think of the first wave of Black Lives Matter, which was about 4 or 5 years ago, how that had a certain level of impact and how it was a bit of a wake-up call for people and the institutions. And that meant that they did address some of the inequities that are prevailing. And in terms of art forms, it meant that there was more funding and the doors opened a little bit more in this country to artists of color, which meant that there was more work to produce. So for example, we've had quite a breakthrough for non-fiction books in this country for the last 4 or 5 years, including British by F.W. Hirsch, and Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge, and various other books. And we've never had those kinds of books published in this country before, ever, right? Because non-fiction was simply, we were simply absent from the world of non-fiction, almost completely. And then the second wave of Black Lives Matter happened earlier this year. And I don't really think that it was our work that precipitated that. I think that was coming from the political agenda. But I think it was a big wake-up call for the institutions, and they're now sort of perhaps a bit more seriously considering how they operate in terms of artists and who gets published and so on. But in the broader sense of stories and the narratives we have about ourselves as people in this society, then you are talking about racist stereotyping, and you're talking about the narrative of Black criminality in this country and in America, and the outrage people have about that, the abuses of the police system and the judiciary. There are so many things that we can look at in terms of the broader narratives about Blackness and brownness in these societies.
Mm-hmm. There's a question from Kajuli Khanna about your choosing to omit punctuation, though I don't think it was punctuation altogether. It was the full stop. She wants to know why you chose to do that. And it took a bit of getting used to, but it turned out to be fun.
I think anyone who is used to reading traditional novels are probably like, oh my God, what's this? I need my full stops. And I chose that form because it's a very free-flowing writing experience. And I loved it, actually. And I have used it before in my previous book, Mr. Loverman. And just getting rid of the full stops meant that literally the story flowed out of me, because you don't have the full stops to stop you, literally. And so I just have these commas, and I have the shape of the text on the page, which is also unorthodox and not quite poetry, or is it poetry? And so really it was about the liberating my imagination through playing around with the form of the novel, and because it flows through all the different characters as well, and I think it helps to make the novel much more cohesive as a single novel, even though you have all these different characters who have all their different sections. And some people might think, oh, it sounds like short stories, but it's not, because they're all interconnected. Yeah. So there's an interconnectedness between the lines on the page because of the commas and without the full stops. But there's also this interconnectedness between all the characters as well, as you kind of swim through the novel and kind of experience their, if in a sense, subconsciousness. And I call the novel a fusion fiction.
Mm-hmm. There's a question, and possibly the last one that we can take, from Zoya, who says, you have expressed your support for Roxane Gay's claim that we must find a new discourse for discussing inequality. In what way do you think your writing, and in particular your most recent book, aspires to contribute to this new discourse?
I think it's the book, from what I've heard, my initial impulse with this book was just to people as many Black British women in a novel as I could. And what I've discovered through meeting so many readers over the last year, that people have been enlightened by it, and that they've said to me that they're living in this city, London, and not all of the book is set in London, but a lot of it is. And they realize that there are so many people here and they just don't know who they are and they don't know their stories. London, the UK, the big cities are quite racially mixed, but there's also a level of, sort of people sticking in the social groups that are most like them. And so it's about making the unfamiliar familiar to people, and also showing perspectives that a lot of people won't have encountered before. And I think fiction is one of the wonderful ways in which you can inhabit characters and see things from other people's points of view in a very kind of lived, creative, exciting, immersive way. And that's as opposed to somebody writing an essay, and as opposed to some kind of drama where everything has to be externalized. You don't know what's going on inside the characters. You imagine. But in fiction, you are inside their heads. And with this book, you are inside so many heads and so many different stories that the effect, I've been told, is that people feel enlightened. And I think that's a way to heal some of the divisions in our society. And I think it's, yeah. So that's my answer.
Thank you so much, Bernardine. We are out of time, unfortunately, but I really enjoyed this. I know I will be revisiting it so that I can actually listen again to all the interesting things you've said. I'm handing it over now to Sanjoy. Sanjoy, are you on?
Can I just say, Anjum, it was a really lovely interview. And like I said, I get asked the same questions, but you weren't asking me the same questions. And that's such a relief to me.
Thanks a lot.
And then your observations were so, so nuanced and complex. So are you an academic as well?
No, but I am, I do write quite a lot of criticism. I write about fiction as well as write fiction, and I try to keep the two things separate, but they tend to sort of.
Well, that came over, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Anjum, and thank you, Bernardine, for bringing us such wonderful characters, and as you said, enlightening us and healing us, and doing all of that without full stops. And thank you for your positive frame of mind and your positive view. More strength to both of you, more power to your sales. Thank you all for watching. We hope that you're going to stay on for our next session that we're going to start pretty soon. We thank our partners, the Aga Khan Foundation, and our patron, the Murthy Family Foundation, for their support. Please do stay on for the next session, The Mathematics of Stardom. Shakuntala Devi, Nainika Mahatani, and Vidya Balan in conversation with Bhavani Tripathi Tikku. And join us over this fabulous weekend for more sessions. To also please consider donating to help us bridge the financial gap for JLF London at the British Library, which is free to view by clicking on the link below. And also, please do support the British Library by donating to them. Thank you, and see you at the next session.
Bye.